It's been only a few days since the start of the patch, and naturally the only thing left to do after going over the new Korean builds and the broken things on the patch, we've got to give you guys our predictions for the top performers. Now keep in mind, we're not making this totally blind, but it's not totally accurate either. It's still only a few days into the patch, and considering that we have another 10 days on the patch, there's plenty of time for stuff to change. But you know what we don't have time for? You futzing around with the like and sub buttons. So hand them over your clicks, cause that's what they want, and then they'll go away, and then we can jump right in. You probably remember that last time we did this, we recommended Annie and even provided the 1-800-ANNIE hotline for you to call in order to subscribe to the Church of Annie right away. And well, what do you know? She's absolutely dominating on last patch, and she continues to be having that pattern on this one, considering that she didn't get nerfed at all. It just makes sense. But the thing that really took me off guard was the fact that everybody is still using Electrocute, when the real reason why you wanted to pick Annie because of the rework was to abuse Rylai's and Liandry's on her, and people are still building completely different things in their runes and items without taking advantage of the real things the changes gave her. For those of you already subscribed to the Church of Annie and newcomers alike, you can call 1-800-COMET and be inducted into the new build. This comes at no extra cost. The only thing it does is give you more LP. On Annie, you're supposed to be taking Comet with Nimbus Cloak, Transcendence, Scorch, Sheep Shot, and Relentless Hunter with attack speed adaptive in MR or Armor depending on your matchup in your minor runes with Flash and Ignite. The whole purpose of this build is to get you really dominating the lane with your range and your Comet and Scorch procs over and over again. And then eventually when you get your Rylai's, and especially when you get your Liandry's, Sheep Shot, Scorch, and Tibbers just absolutely grind away anybody in the game. On top of that, Annie's E-buffs made it so that health is more valuable on her because she has more damage reduction, and that supports her building more health to actually make use of that damage reduction with. Even if you do happen to be taking Electrocute or are just learning Annie and want to stick to something really simple without having to worry about a specific playstyle, you'll still do fine just picking her up on this patch, as she is still very strong. As far as the items go for this build, you probably already guessed what's really important here since I already mentioned it, or I guess it's really not a guess and more of just me telling you ahead of time because I'm kinda dumb, but that is what it is. What you do need to know though is that you should start a Corrupting Potion. Annie will have mana problems with this build, you have no way of getting any mana back, and Doran's Ring isn't really enough, and the fact that you have really high range and good trading in the early game is amplified by the Corrupting Potion, so it's just an excellent option, even if you aren't taking something like Time Warp Tonic. From there, Rylai's into Sword Shoes into Liandry's is pretty standard and is really strong. You can go Rabadons because you probably don't need any more survivability, and immediately afterwards avoid Staff to just erase anybody. And last item, you can get Zhonya's if you feel like you really need it, but you might not even, and you can instead opt for more damage or a different type of defensive item like Banshee's Veil. Now the next two champions are also returners from last patch, and well, I mean what can I say other than it makes sense. For those of you who don't remember, this patch really only buffed Brand in the mid lane, which is laughable at best, and they also buffed Victor a little bit. That's not really going to be a problem for a majority of the champions who are strong right now. That being said, the next champion we're going to go over is Galio, and literally nothing has changed about him since last patch, so he's going to be a quick run over. You want to take Aftershock on Galio with Shield Bash, Bone Plating, Overgrowth, Nimbus Cloak, and Transcendence with double adaptive and MR if you can take it. If you have to take armor because you have a physical damage matchup, that's okay. You don't have to feel too bad about that. As far as items go on Galio, again, the same thing, he's still really good. Proto Belt into Sork Shoes with Zhonya's is your core item choices. You can rush a Zhonya's if you're fighting an AD threat early on, but you still want to get the Proto Belt. It's part of your burst pattern and also really important for the mobility, as Galio can't only rely on his E all the time. After that, you can go a Liandry's into a Rabadon's and then a Void Staff. Galio does need a little bit of health after building Proto Belt and Zhonya's in order to make himself even harder to kill, so you can't really get away with rushing a Rabadon's right after that, which is why you get the Liandry's in between. The last mid laner, also a returner, and a long-time staple in the mid lane despite not being played too much, is Pyke. He is still strong after all this time and all the targeted nerfs that Riot has given him. His team-fighting power and roaming potential is just too strong, really, to justify being played anywhere else. You don't want to put him in support where he's somewhat crippled by not having as much gold, and you don't want to really play him top lane where he can actually get bullied by some other melee top laners. For runes on Pyke, you want to take Halo Blades with Cheap Shot, Eyeball Collection, Ultimate Hunter, Second Wind, and actually, wait a minute, hold on, I lied, there's a new change here. Pyke players are taking the new Unflinching for what it offers to him as a defensive rune, which is way better than anything else he could take. Sure, you could argue Revitalize is good for his sustain, but at the end of the day, 5% isn't going to make that big of a difference, while the 10 to 30% tenacity and slow resistance will. And much like Galio, the items really haven't changed, and this time I'm not actually lying, I promise. You want to rush a Tiamat, as it is the only way for Pyke to get wave clear. From there you can go Moby Boots or potentially Swifties if you really want to have that in-combat movement speed, and then go a Duskblade, into a Yumu's, then an Umbral Glaive, then a GA, and sell your Tiamat last item for either a Death Stance or Edge of Night depending on what you need against the enemy team. We've wrapped up the mid lane, and frankly, there wasn't really many changes to the mid lane, so this one's a fast one. But now, let's jump up to the top lane where we have seen some changes. There is a newcomer in the top lane and also somebody that we should mention as potentially being good in the very near future, and who knows, might actually take over this patch. Volibear is on the brink of greatness when it comes to the top lane, and while he is far better in the jungle right now, Riot has said that they are not going to stop buffing him until they have him in a comfortable spot in both the jungle and the top lane. And considering that high elo and specifically top lane is still a little bit lacking, they're likely going to shift power around in his kit a little bit to make him have a better performance there. While it might not come as a hotfix buff, there are still people learning how to play Volibear appropriately, and once people actually figure out the best builds for him in the top lane and start to agree on something, and actually that applies to the jungle too, we might see a surge in win rate. With a lot of people already playing him and him actually having a somewhat decent ban rate, that would be the main thing to look out for as a sudden sign that Volibear has gone really wrong somewhere. Or I guess really right, depending on what your point of view is. With that out of the way, let's talk about our actual predictions that we can give you guys information on. Number 1 is going to be Singed, and honestly, was anybody surprised? Singed has been kind of flying under the radar as a champion who is performing absurdly well in the top lane for like, what, 6 patches now? Something like that, maybe even more. I don't really know why he's doing so well, despite other top laners that do well against him also being strong, as what Singed normally has to do is get some kind of lead early on in the game and then express that lead over his laner over and over again and 2v1 people because he's so fast, and it seems like people aren't able to actively shut him down as much as they used to. The summoner spell choices for Singed are also up for debate, with the recently buffed and potentially extremely powerful Ghost being here. We might see a shift in what summoner spells Singed players are taking in the next couple weeks. For runes on Singed, you want to go Conqueror with Triumph, Tenacity, Last Stand, Taste of Blood, and Ravenous Hunter, with double adaptive and Armor or MR depending on your matchup in your minor runes. From there, as far as the summoner spells go, like I said, Ghost is in contention right now with its new buff. The extended duration, the no ramp up, and all that other goodness is very strong on him. Still though, most people are taking Flash Ignite across all elos and performing really well with it. For items, you want to rush your boots pretty much as fast as you possibly can, and you also want to buy an early Dark Seal to complement the Corrupting Potion that you start with. Your boots also do have the options of being any of Tabby, Merc Treads, or Swifties depending on what you're looking at on the enemy team, and all of them are actually relatively just about as common as the others. After that though, Singed gets a little bit less flexible, as in basically every single matchup, you want to get a Rylai's and then a Liandry's. It's just such a powerful item combination on him and gives him everything he wants pretty much. He already has a ton of movement speed and decent stats overall thanks to his ultimate, and what you really need is a way to shut down your opponents consistently, and having a constant slow as well as burning damage that's based on maximum HP is a pretty convincing argument. From there, you want to make sure you pick up a Righteous Glory for absolutely absurd engage potential, a Spirit Visage for the healing synergy, which you do have a lot of thanks to the potions, thanks to your Conqueror, and Taste of Blood. And lastly, if you find yourself still lacking movement speed and you don't need a pure offensive or defensive item, you can grab yourself a Deadman's. Otherwise, look out for stuff like Void Staff or maybe even pure defensive items, something like a Thornmail to stop people's healing, or hey, if you're the main damage dealer on your team, don't be shy of buying a Morellonomicon. That might just be your best choice as a last item. After Singed, you probably guess who's coming next, and that's gonna be Urgot. Top lane, much like mid lane, really only has Volibear getting changes, and I mean, I guess you could say Akali got changes as well, but really, who's looking at that champion? Riot just happened to close their eyes and throw 2 darts at a dartboard, and one hit plus 5 damage on passive, and the other one hit plus 0.05 damage ratio on their passive. And then they were like, yeah, sure, ship it, that'll fix the champion. No matter what context you try and take that change in, it makes absolutely 0 sense in every single one. Doesn't matter if you're looking at it in terms of pro play, high elo, the very high elo, which I think Riot distincts it's like, oh, high elo versus elite or whatever. absolutely silly in my opinion, but it kind of makes sense. And then lastly, of course, is everybody else. It doesn't make sense anywhere, so why even bother making the change? But enough about Akali, we're talking about Urgot here after all. You want to take Conqueror, Triumph, Tenacity, Last Stand, Conditioning, and Overgrowth. And here, we do see some people taking the new Unflinching, as Urgot is one of those champions who can have really insane healing. Considering he goes Cleaver and then Death Stance as his first and second items, you could see why it's a pretty convincing argument to have quite a bit of Tenacity while you're sticking around a little bit lower in the health bar. Having that little bit of extra tenacity right in the moment where you need it to reel in your R a little bit sooner can be the difference between you killing somebody and then also killing their ally, or you just dying in a 2v1. Now, I know I'm bad at telling you guys things in order, and I always constantly reference items when I'm talking about runes and reference runes when I'm talking about items. I try, really I do, but it's hard to not talk about these things because they work together. For items on Urgot, you want to go Cleaver into defensive boots, either Tabby or Mercrest depending on the enemy team, and then grab yourself that Death Stance. From there, you have Righteous Glory if you really want to engage on the enemy team. If not, you could go for something more offensive. The key here is to find an item that happens to give you 10% CDR, so you have 40% from your Black Cleaver plus your Death Stance and that item. After that, GA is one of the most popular items in the 5th slot for Urgot, and I mean, it makes sense. With Urgot's itemization and abilities, he has the ability to just kind of turn on the moment that he gets out of the stasis effect. And when he has even just a little bit of health, he can get some shielding, get some healing from Death Stance and Conqueror. He has the tenacity he needs to get out of those scenarios. It's going to be pretty strong. Lastly, the other most popular item to get on Urgot as one of the last items you can get is a Mortal Reminder. Urgot can do a lot of damage, and sometimes he can struggle with the super high armor tanks and some of the carries who tend to build some armor. Namely, you can think of somebody like Ezreal who can build Iceborne Gauntlet and Ninja Tabby and a Death Stance. This would really help you in that case. It's also important to mention that Urgot can benefit from Spirit Visage greatly thanks to his good healing, and if you ever find yourself actually needing MR rather than armor, Spirit Visage is a totally fine option to go in the place of GA, or even as a last item. The last top laner we're going to go over is a returner to the top lane, but this time with a different style and a slightly different build. Wukong for a while felt kinda although he was still strong, it seemed like he had lost the flair with a lot of people, but now he's one of the strongest top laners again, thanks to some of the meta changes and just people learning him better. People have changed the way that they're playing Wukong, and you can take advantage of it too. They're going super aggressive, taking Flash Ignite with Conqueror, Triumph, Alacrity, Last Stand, Magical Footwear, and Biscuits with double adaptive and armor in their minor runes. This is very clearly a super hyper aggro focused early game. You don't take the attack speed rune in your minor runes, and you focus on your E giving you enough attack speed along with Alacrity in order to get you what you need to win 1v1s in the early game on top of your Ignite. And I'm not ashamed to admit that I myself have fallen for this before. I walk into top lane, the Wukong has Ignite, he has a Corrupting Potion, he walks into lane, and I just kind of try and fight him level 1. And then I realize that I just get beat down super hard because of the difference in attack speed that we have, and then I just end up losing by level 2. Don't get baited into the early fight with Wukong, and if you are playing Wukong, try and engage that fight. If nothing really ends up happening early though, that's not a problem as you still scale really well. You want to rush a Tiamat as Wukong does lack wave clear, and from there go Tabby or Mercrest depending on the enemy team, and then rush a Triforce. Before, many people were rushing Blade of the Ruined King, but it seems like Wukong players have come to the agreement that it's no longer really necessary most of the time. Instead, you go for that Triforce and then get a Death Stance, and that's where your main damage and sustain comes in. After that, Sterix is an amazing option as it gives you great defensive power and can even bait some people into fighting your clone because your Sterix shields pops on the clone and they're really confused. It's kind of like doubly selling the bait. It's really interesting. After that, as a last item, you can get a GA, or if you happen to be playing a very damage-oriented role against people who can just kill you immediately out of GA, which can happen against people like Caitlyn, who can set up traps on your dead body. Instead, if that's the case, you might want to end up going a Ravenous Hydra or a Titanic Hydra and actually finish out that Tiamat that you got in the early game. Something that's very important to League is just learning how to itemize and adapting your build like that. If you don't make those decisions or you make the wrong ones, you can really cripple yourself by having a bad build. This actually applies to runes as well. We try to give you guys the best we can here, but we don't always get to go super in depth on each champion because, you know, we gotta cover something for everybody. If you're looking for something like that, then you should go check out our website GameLeap.com, where we have tons of guides all done by challenger level players, going over things like itemization on runes, on individual champion guides, even just how to play and learning all the combos with those champions we cover too. No matter what kind of guide you're looking for, or what skill level you're starting at, or skill level you're trying to become, we have something up there for you. And now that you have access to all those big brain resources, we can talk about the big brain role of the Bush Boys. Jungle is very interesting, and let me say this ahead of time as a disclaimer. I am solely going off of what stats websites are reporting here, specifically for Volibear, and that's for two reasons. One, I haven't played enough games of the champion, and two, I haven't played any games on the recently buffed Volibear. So to say I know exactly what I'm talking about would be absolutely stupid and arrogant, and I'm from New York, so neither of those are true, obviously. With all that being said, Volibear's most popular and well-performing runes in the jungle across all roles take Conqueror with Triumph, Tenacity, Last Stand, and then in high elo, Conditioning and Unflinching are the most popular, with in lower ranks, Nimbus Cloak and Water Walking being popular. I mentioned those two differences because this can be explained really easily, and I want to show you guys why the first one is actually a lot better no matter what you're looking at. First of all, Volibear builds a lot of resistances, and having that stacking resistances from conditioning can make the difference in you living or dying, especially on somebody who doesn't have that many defensive tools. He can get bonus health from his R, and bonus health and shielding from his E, and that's about it. Squeezing everything you can out of his resistances for his actual just straight up tankiness through items is very important. Having Nimbus Cloak and Water Walking can feel good because you hit Blue Smite, go zoom zoom, hit the enemy, maybe you kill him. But at the end of the day, Unflinching is a much more powerful rune for Volibear because Tenacity is very important on somebody who wants to try and invade the backline like him. And it could also be crucial in allowing him to escape from that area if he can no longer really be there and survive. If Volibear ends up having to stick in one place for too long, he will die faster than most other tanks, as all he has is a shield and some bonus health. Having extra movement speed with two different runes isn't going to be what solves that. Having the consistent tenacity and slow resistance will. And that's something that's important to remember across all champions that you're playing who are like this playstyle where they dive into the backline pretty often. With items on Volibear, these are what's the most popular and doing very well right now. You want to go Cinder Hulk with either Blue or Red Smite depending on what you're looking at on the enemy team. From there you go either Tabbies, Merchants, or Swifties, as all are actually very good on Volibear, and then you get yourself a Triforce, a Deadman's, a Spear Visage, and lastly a Warmogs. With the health ratios that Volibear has, building this sort of health and having some armor and magic resist in the Deadman's and the Spear Visage is pretty good. Cinder Hulk also has synergy with the rest of the health items, considering that literally every single item gives him at least some health, and Triforce gives Volibear just about every single stat that he wants and needs. But now that we've covered the champion with the big flashing lights around him that just says, hey look at me, I'm kind of an anomaly, let's cover the next jungler who has been here before but's kind of been flying under the radar. This is Wukong's time to shine again, it seems, as he is doing very well in the jungle once again. You want to take Conqueror with Triumph, Alacrity, Coup de Grace, Sudden Impact, and Relentless Hunter, with attack speed, adaptive, and armor in your minor runes, and flash and smite. And really guys, it's kind of boring from here. You're basically just mimicking a top lane Wukong, but you have a jungle item. You get a Warriors with either Tabby or Merchants depending on the enemy team, and then you get yourself the Triforce, Death Stance, and Sterix, and a GA. Boom, you're basically top lane Wukong minus one item. Congratulations. Honestly, it feels pretty lame, and it also feels like something is very wrong, that a champion can be played in two different roles with the exact same build and also perform almost exactly the same. Seems like a bit of a balance failure there or something. Hard to tell exactly what's up, but we'll see if that changes along the rest of the patch. The last jungler we're going to go over is somebody who got a very tiny little pebble-sized nerf, and that's Fiddlesticks, who is still very strong right now. On Fiddlesticks, you want to go Electrocute, as it is a more consistent and really good option compared to Dark Harvest, which is very snowbally. From there, you go Cheap Shot with Eyeball Collection, Ultimate Hunter, Nimbus Cloak, and Transcendence with double adaptive and armor in your minor runes. Now, I'm not going to say that you can't use Dark Harvest, but just keep in mind that you do have a weaker early game. And considering that Fiddlesticks' early game is kinda already somewhat weak, you probably don't want to double down on that. The items haven't really changed much either. You're going Runic Echoes with Sorc Shoes, Zanyas, Liandry's, Rabadons, and Void Staff. Now that we're done with the jungle, we could jump on down to the bot lane for the 5-man tower dive and talk about some AD carries. Now, let me rapid fire through two of them because they've been in the spotlight for a little while now. With the hyper carry meta kind of coming back in here and the support meta changing greatly to suit that, you have Jinx and Kog'Maw tearing people up left and right ever since like 2 patches ago. Jinx takes lethal tempo with Presence of Mind, Bloodline, Coup de Grace, or Cut Down if the enemy has a lot of tanks, and then Nimbus Cloak and Gathering Storm with attack speed, adaptive, and armor in her minor runes. You also want to take Flash Heal or potentially Flash Barrier if you have a support who wants to take heal, And maybe you're even playing with support who already has heal and exhaust like Yumi. From there, Jinx's items really haven't changed at all. You go Infinity Edge with Berserkers into a Runon's Hurricane. These are her 3 core items and they really haven't changed. We've seen some deviation from certain players, but really that's been standard. After that, you go Rapid Fire Cannon and then Bloodthirster and lastly a GA. Now here's where I want to insert the disclaimer that just because Jinx players are going Bloodthirster and then GA last item does not mean that Death's Dance isn't as good. And I'm fairly certain that as people begin to realize that Death's Dance is actually extremely overpowered on basically any AD carry who can actually use it, that you're gonna be seeing a lot more Jinxes building Death's Dance 5th item and then going for an actual Last Whisper item as their last item. Since Jinx is the type of AD carry who gets a support that can shield and heal them anyways, them having the bleeding from the Death's Dance isn't that big of a deal, and the armor and magic resist as well as the bleed serves to function as effectively what the Bloodthirster shield would be and the armor from the GA. But enough about me big braining the meta like 30 years ahead of time, let's talk about Kog'Maw. Kog'Maw also takes lethal tempo, but he goes Triumph, Alacrity, Coup de Grace or Cut Down, and Taste of Blood and Ravenous Hunter, with the attack speed adapted and armor in the minor runes just like Jinx. From here though, something that's very interesting is that across all ranks, Kog'Maws are taking Flash Barrier pretty much every single time. A very interesting decision, and also one that's worth mentioning, which you should replicate in your games. While we can't go and check every individual game and actually see if the supports are taking heal, it is worth mentioning that Barrier is a better solo defensive summoner spell. It shields for more than heal actually, well, heals, and so that can matter. For items though, Kog'Maw is entirely on-hit focused, going Blade of the Ruined King into Berserker Greaves and then a Rage Blade into a Renon's Hurricane. This allows him to get really good split shots against the entire enemy team and apply multiple on-hits, including his W, Rage Blade, and Blade of the Ruined King. From there, you even go one step further by getting a Wit's End, and then lastly, since you have no armor or other defensive items other than the Wit's End, you go a GA. With the Enchanter supports who also have really good enabling power, it seems like Kog'Maw doesn't need a Frozen Mallet to survive things anymore, and that's a big deal as he can buy even more damage like the Wit's End. The last AD carry is somebody who we're going to spend a little bit more time on, and that is Twitch, as Twitch is a very interesting AD carry when you compare him to the rest of the competition, and particularly Jinx and Kog'Maw. You see, these Twitches are taking Press the Attack with Triumph, Alacrity, Coup de Grace, Magical Footwear, Biscuits, and Attack Speed Adaptive and Armor in their minor runes, but they're also almost always taking Flash Exhaust, and this is a really interesting choice. What ends up happening is that the Exhaust lets Twitch 1v1 AD carries no matter what the range discrepancy is, even if he doesn't have his ultimate up. Exhaust is simply too strong and completely shuts down basically any AD carry unless they somehow have a QSS. Twitch is able to do a lot more damage in a much shorter period of time, especially when he has them exhausted, and because of that, no matter how behind he might be, he always has the opportunity to sneak up on your AD carry if you're by yourself, and then get a kill. That can send him catapulting into a lead thanks to shutdown gold and more, and that's really catastrophic. Twitch builds Blade of the Ruined King, then Berserker Greaves, and then Renon's Hurricane. After that, he grabs an Infinity Edge, a Phantom Dancer, and lastly, a Mortal Reminder. And now finally, last but not least, we get to talk about supports, and support actually hasn't changed at all, which is, yeah, that's kind of sad, but that doesn't mean we can't go over it. Honestly, I wouldn't be too surprised if Riot is really taking this sort of reserved approach to the bottom lane here, because they're focusing on seeing how their AD carry changes actually impact the meta. And okay, they can get a little bit of a pass for that, but hopefully they don't do this for the rest of the season. That would be really, really sad. Let's dive into the first support, which is Taric. Taric is actually a surprisingly aggressive champion for somebody who is very good at keeping people alive. At least in the early game, he's very aggressive. You go Guardian, which has been buffed recently, with Font of Life, Bone Plating, Revitalize, Presence of Mind, and Legend Tenacity, with attack speed and double armor in your minor runes. You take Flash Ignite. This is because Taric's strength in the early game should never be underestimated. He could actually outduel some AD carries thanks to his passive and the way it works with his looping abilities. As far as items go, you probably already guessed that Taric really wants to build super supportive items that also give him tankiness. Here nothing has really changed. You want to start a Relic Shield and then get Merc Treads, as having tenacity to cast your very impactful abilities is very, very important. From there you go a Zeke's into a Knight's Vow, and then a Redemption or an Ardent Censer depending on what your team comp is looking like, and then based on which one you got before, you either get a Locket to combo with the Redemption, or a Mikael's if you really need it. The second support here is going to be Janna, and I will mention something after I go over these initial runes. You want to take Comet on Janna with Mana Flow, Celerity, Scorch, Taste of Blood, and Relentless Hunter, with double adaptive and armor in your minor runes and a Flash Ignite. You also do have another option in taking the recently buffed Guardian, which is better on ranged supports now. This is worth mentioning because this actually might change over the course of the patch, and while it's only really prevalent right now in higher elo, it might trickle its way down and see some more play. As far as items though, nothing has really changed here. You're going Relic Shield in the early game for the more consistent timing on your wards. You're not going to be able to get all the money all the time with Spell Thieves, as it is somewhat inconsistent, as your opponents might not actually be able to be poked in a given lane. After that, you can pick up Moby Boots or Swifties if you're trying to have in-combat movement speed, which is very valid, but you're probably going to have better time roaming with the Moby Boots than anything else. And after that, you go for an Athene's, then an Ardent Censer, then a Redemption, and lastly a Shirelia's. This gives you a mix of some stats to really have a defense with in terms of health and magic resist, as well as some nice healing additions, and of course 40% cooldown reduction. Now the very last champion we're going over here is going to be Sona. Not really too much variety here in the supports, but I mean hey, it makes sense in terms of what's good in the meta right now. Sona prefers to take Airy with Mana Flow, Transcendence, Scorch, Presence of Mind, and Cut Down with double adaptive and armor in her minor runes. She also takes Flash Ignite, despite being one of the squishiest and also technically one of the most defensive champions in the game. She is very squishy, but because of that, Cut Down is almost always a benefit to her, and her high range can take advantage of Scorch, Mana Flow, and to a certain degree the Airy as well. In terms of itemization, because you do have higher range and more agency than somebody like Janna, you can actually afford to go Spell Thieves, as it's not hard for Sona to hit her Q on enemy champions. After that, you can pick up an Athene's as soon as you possibly can, and then eventually getting yourself either a pair of Moby Boots or more likely something like Swifties or Lucidity Boots to keep yourself defensive. Once Sona gets hit, you're probably dead, so having cooldowns up to be able to give yourself more movement speed or more healing and shielding, or having the movement speed to dodge things in the first place is better than just buying a purely defensive boot almost all the time. After that, assuming that you didn't actually pick up the Lucidity Boots, you can go for a 40% cooldown reduction build by getting an Ardent Censer, and then a Redemption, and then a Shirelia's. And with that, that's this patch's predictions on the best performers in each role. Surprisingly, this patch is shaping up to be a really hectic one in terms of the top performers. It seems like there's a big gap between the top and the not so top. The middle, that's what they call that. If you're looking to pick up new champions like the ones that are at the top of our lists, then you definitely need to go check out our website, GameLeap.com, where we have guides on many of the champions we've gone over in this video, and we're always working on more with our challenger level content creators. Besides that, we are always pumping out other content revolving around macro, lane-specific guides and tips, as well as anything from beginning all the way up to super advanced skills. There's no better place for you to go and learn in order to improve and actually win in your games. And if you just take some of the skills into your next game, you will 100% notice a difference. And if you made it this far, thanks for watching the whole video. These are always long ones, including a long boy for our tier lists. It just kind of ends up being that way when I'm covering that many champions, and I'm trying to get better at it, but really one step at a time. Hopefully you guys noticed that this week's Korean builds was actually a much shorter video, even though it covered roughly the same amount of champions as last time. But we're already rolling really long. So anyways, my name is Ace Windstorm, and I will see you all later.